welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I'm your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Got a great program lined up for you today. Later in this edition of Border Report Live, South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez is going to be leading a conversation with Harvard professor Gabrielle Oliveira, author of Now We Are Here. It's a new book examining family migration, education, and the sacrifices immigrant parents make in search of a better life. That conversation is coming up, so make sure to stay tuned for that. But first, as always, we're going to start today's edition by taking a look at what's trending across the border. Starting with over the weekend, Costa Rica received 25 migrants deported from the United States, marking the first transfer under a bilateral agreement signed in March to manage irregular migration. The migrants arrived aboard a U.S. plane at Juan Santa Maria International Airport. Among the deportees are people from countries such as Albania, Morocco, China, India, Cameroon, Kenya, Guatemala, and Honduras. That's according to Costa Rican migration authorities. The agreement was signed in March by Costa Rican President Rodrigo Chavez and U.S. Shield of the Americas envoy Kristi Noem, who was the former Homeland Security Secretary. Costa Rica will receive up to 25 people per week from the United States, while the International Organization for Migration will provide food and lodging during the first 7 days of their stay in the country. A Costa Rican immigration official said the comeback program is voluntary. He said any deportees who do not wish to return to their country and for fears of persecution, can remain in Costa Rica. Earlier this month, you may remember we told you about a New Jersey pastor arrested by ICE while he was working his day job. Yason Cortez Vasquez was back at his church in Elizabeth, New Jersey on Sunday, just 1 day after being released from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement custody. He was held at the Delaney Hall detention facility in Newark since March 20th. A Department of Homeland Security spokesperson said the pastor illegally entered the country in January 2016 from Colombia. Vasquez allegedly overstayed a tourist visa that expired in July of that same year. In a statement, Homeland Security said Cortez Vasquez has been released on bond with a GPS monitor while he undergoes further removal proceedings. He will receive full due process, end quote. A fellow pastor at the church said ICE detainments have ravaged the Latino church community. He said church attendance has dropped anywhere from 30 to 80% because people are afraid to attend. Nevada leaders are weighing in on a controversial immigration policy that could impact thousands of workers across their state. A rule change announced under the Trump administration eliminated automatic extensions for certain work permits. And as Nicholas Sommer reports, it could severely impact the state's gambling industry.
Lose their job, not be able to work. What if they're your teacher, your nurse, you work in our hospitality industry? A third of individuals in the state of Nevada work in hospitality.
In Las Vegas, a growing concern among immigration service providers: what happens when legal workers suddenly can't work? A rule change announced under the Trump administration eliminated automatic extensions for certain work permits, leaving many immigrants in limbo, creating uncertainty not just for their families, but for the businesses that rely on them.
But many employers don't know that.
Senator Jackie Rosen says that's due in part to backlogs at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which processes those permits. Without automatic work permit extensions, those who filed every single rule correctly can still find themselves unable to work in a waiting game that could last months.
You can only apply to renew your work permit 6 months in advance. Well, it currently takes up to 18 months to get it done, and less than half get it done within the 6 months.
Senator Rosen is now leading an effort in Washington to overturn the policy and restore automatic extensions for work permits.
It's called the CRA, Congressional Review Act. We've got the 30 required signatures to bring it to the floor. We go back into session on Monday, so I'm hoping to get it done in the next few weeks.
Senator Rosen says restoring automatic extensions would help stabilize Nevada's workforce, especially in industries that depend heavily on immigrant labor.
Our immigrant community is going to be impacted. Our entire economy will begin to collapse because of this.
That was Nicholas Sommer reporting. He says in Nevada, immigrants make up nearly 1 in every 5 workers. Nationwide, advocacy groups estimate hundreds of thousands of work permit holders could be impacted by delays each year. A 39-year-old Bangladeshi national will be in federal court today in Laredo, Texas. Saiful Islam was extradited from Brazil after an indictment was unsealed today, charging him for his role in a conspiracy that smuggled immigrants through Central America to the United States. According to court documents, Islam and others moved the migrants from Sao Paulo, Brazil, to South America, Central America, and Mexico. They were then brought to the U.S.-Mexico border here in South Texas and told to swim across the Rio Grande or jump over the metal border walls. Islam is charged with conspiracy to bring an alien to the United States, multiple counts of bringing an alien to the United States for financial gain, and conspiracy to encourage and induce an alien to enter the United States. He is facing several years behind bars. And that's a look at what's trending across the border. Remember, you can read these and more stories 24/7 on borderreport.com. Time now to bring in our South Texas correspondent, Sandra Sanchez, and our guest for today's program, Harvard professor Gabrielle Oliveira, author of Now We Are Here, a new book examining family migration, education, and the sacrifices immigrant parents make in search of a better life.
Thanks, Rudy. Thanks so much for joining us, Gabrielle. And you are from Brazil. We just had a segment, someone talking about smuggling people from Brazil through Mexico. Your book I found fascinating. Now We Are Here, Family Migration, Children's Education, and Dreams for a Better Life. The book just came out, and in it, you interview 16 families, and some are from Brazil, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, I understand from 2018 to 2021. And you studied the migration patterns of these families. Specifically, they all had children and came through Mexico and its effects on the children and I guess on their education. What was the takeaway? What were you going for with the book and why have it come out now?
Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. One of the things that for me was really important was to document how families were talking about specifically how an immigration policy impacted their lives and the lives of children, talking about specifically the separation and the detention that happened at the border and how young children as young as 5 years old continue to talk about that inside classrooms, inside schools, talking to teachers about it. So the heart of the book is really to bring to light how even though immigration policy may seem far away from classrooms and schools and young kids, is very much in their lives, and they continue to carry a lot of the trauma of what happened at the border as they grow. So the takeaway of the book is really to bring this visibility to how different immigration policies, right, not just separation and detention, but different ones, how they continue to be part of children and families' lives, even after they were released, reunified, and enrolled in schools.
Now, you're an associate professor of education and Brazil studies at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. So I was interested when I was reading the book in one part. You said when you talk to them, I mean, almost like a teacher. You were evaluating their situation. I mean, tell me about the research you did. How often did you meet with these families? I mean, it seemed like some of them you met with weekly.
Yes, so for the 16 families in the book, I met with them weekly for the 3 years. There was one interruption, which was 2020 with COVID. So we had to kind of do FaceTime. So the families would have dinner and FaceTime me and put me, at the table with them so we could continue our conversations. But I was in schools, I was in classrooms, I was at the church, I was at baptisms, parties, people's homes, doctors' offices, playgrounds, because my type of work is what we call this type of ethnographic work, right? So I follow the lives of these 16 families in a lot of depth. So because the goal was really for people when you're reading the book, not to just see families, right, as heroes or victims, but they're a little bit of everything. So this kind of multi-dimensional take on how people get to live their lives and how destabilizing it can be for something that happened to them right at the border, but then they're able to find their foot again. They're able to enroll their kids in school. They get jobs and then COVID hits. So it's taking people through all of that. So in my work, I was with them through and through, to understand how daily life actually happened.
Now, there was one you mentioned, the families. There's one Guatemalan father, Julio, who told you something that was very poignant to me. He said, quote, "I wonder if anyone will care. That's kind of like, sets up the book. Now we are here. He spent 72 months. Is that correct? 72 months?
72 days.
72 excuse me, I thought that was wrong.
Yes.
72 days separated from his 5-year-old daughter, Lux, and she was sent to New York. Oh, and also to preface this, your studies were done in Massachusetts, and all these families had eventually come to Massachusetts. This was after he paid $7,000 to get him and his daughter out. It took him 12 days to get to Juarez, which is the other side of El Paso, Texas, and he crossed. And then they go through this separation, and I mean, his 5-year-old daughter just did not understand what it was to be, living apart from her father. I mean, I guess how did you talk to these children? I mean, tell me what they went through, and how did you interpret, and how did you get to their emotional level? Because I mean, she's 5 years old, and how did she describe to you what it was like? She didn't know where Daddy was.
Absolutely. And one of the things that for me is really important in my work as an educator is to really pay attention to what children say. And I think we have limited access often, right? Because how often can we get children to talk about what happened to them in the media or describe these effects, right? We usually get accounts from adults. So for me, it was really interesting to do this work and important. And the ways that I do that is by having children draw or write about their emotions, and just through play. So I spent a lot of time playing with kids, Play-Doh, Barbies, dolls, whatever it is that we are, getting our nails done together or doing that in their homes, and to really wait for them to talk about what happened to them without me prompting it. So I never asked any of the children, how was, to cross, or how did you feel? It was prompted, it came from them as we were talking. And some of these examples are, for example, with Luz, if we're, talking about food, and then she connected with the food that she was fed when she was in a particular foster home, and waiting to hear from her parents or her dad specifically. So she said, I remember eating that, but then I remember that the person there didn't let me have my stuffed animals with me, or they gave me a specific clothing, piece of clothing to wear. So all of those memories are very, very central to them, but they were talking about that through play. They're not talking about that by you conducting, a structured interview.
It's interesting.
Yeah, that's incredibly fascinating. I guess I have a question, kind of in that same realm, is how often do these kids, once you start interacting with them, whether it be, like you said, painting nails together, or, drawing or reading or just talking about food, how often do these children just kind of on their own open up?
In this research for 3 years, there wasn't one time that I was engaging with these families that they didn't talk about it. Sometimes it was a longer narrative. So with Luz, she went on for a while about what happened when she was by herself and the fear that she felt and all of that. Sometimes it was just one mention of a frozen burrito, that was given to them when they were in detention. Or they talked about having an earache and thinking that they had an earache because they were sleeping with their ears on the ground and it was a cold ground and they only had those foil blankets, So they'll feed that into, when you're in the home. In the classroom, I've documented weekly mentions of these kids at any point. They're doing math, and then they say something about what happened to them. They're going around, teachers asking, did you bring food from home, or are you going to buy at school? And they again talk about food bringing them to that detention moment. So they're bringing those things, but it's really up to the adults to stop and connect and not skip over, because our automatic one is if they're not saying something very specific, we kind of may move on, but they're not. They're trying to find moments to share what happened to them during the crossing.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we return, we're going to continue this conversation with Professor Gabrielle Oliveira about her new book, Now We Are Here. Stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 2 minutes. To this edition of Border Report Live. Joining me today, South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez, and our guest for today's program, author of a new book, Now We Are Here. It examines family migration, education, and the sacrifices that immigrant parents and their children make in search of a better life. Professor Gabrielle Oliveira.
Professor, I wanted to ask you, I wanted to go back also for viewers to understand your research took place during the first Trump administration, and there were these new immigration policies that were enacted. There was travel ban, the separation of families, or the zero tolerance policy, where if an adult crossed the border, it was considered not legally crossing with documents, that they were separated from their children. The children were sent elsewhere and detained. The parents were detained, as we mentioned, with the family from Guatemala, the father Julio and the daughter Luz, as one example. And there also was the Migrant Protection Protocols that remain in Mexico policy that forced many of them to wait south of the border. So, I mean, it's kind of like history is repeating itself. We have a lot of these policies happening again. I mean, your book is coming out now, and do you think that it will help people to understand how the previous policies affected people for its publication right now?
I sure hope so. And I appreciate so much being able to be in conversation here, because one of the things that we see is this strategy of destabilizing families, right? So when we saw, as you explained, the zero tolerance policy, that parents and children were separated and detained as a strategy to destabilize a family. So going straight to the family. And now what we're seeing on this side, right, is kind of the removal, the fast removal and deportation of parents, and then young children being left behind here, right? So this idea of family separation continues. And really the goal of the book is to show that I don't think anybody would not agree that children should be without their caregivers, right? Because it's such an important formative moment for their development, for them to go to school, for them to learn and become, productive members of society. That's all so important. And the type of trauma that a separation, a detention, and then a removal now that we see, they all have parallels. And the parallels is this idea of leaving children with fear of going to school, fear of asking for help, fear of going to the doctor, right? Having all these fears. And then when you increase that, you increase violence, you increase, mortality rates, you increase health issues. So all of that affects something that is much broader than just thinking that a simple immigration policy would stay around a particular group of people, right? So the idea of children being without support. So we also have to, the book also sheds a light on the role that teachers have and educators, which they're not being prepared or trained to do a lot of this counseling work and to support parents. And even when children open up and talk about these things at school, educators often will silence or skip over, or they don't want to engage with it out of fear, right? Fear of the visibility that it can bring these children, fear of opening up a can of worms that they can't manage. So all of that has these policies have a huge impact on how children live their lives.
I'm glad you brought up the teachers. There was one moment in the book, and I don't remember which child it was. There were 30 children that you wrote about total, but one, I guess she was about to go into kindergarten, and she said, "Do you think my teacher knows what happened to me? Mm-hmm. Do you think she knows I was held?" I thought that was just a fascinating statement from such a young child. And what did you learn from the teachers when you spoke to them?
The teachers are such heroes. And I think there's this misconception that if teachers are not engaging with children when they're offering that, or they don't know about the stories, it means that they don't care. But they're actually very concerned. And the phrase "now we're here" is actually a repetition of parents, children, and teachers all talking about this idea that we shouldn't really be thinking about the past, that now we're here and we have this chance and we have to make it work. There's no other way, right? So the teachers are very concerned about providing a safe space in the present, which sometimes means that they're not engaging with the past. And then the children are looking for ways to talk about that at every chance they have.
5,500 children were separated from their parents, 200 under the age of 5 during the first Trump administration separation of families policy, which was stopped. Tell me about the parents and how they spoke about what happened. I got the feeling there was a lot of guilt involved, guilt for bringing the children, guilt for what they lived through, right?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that the parents talk a lot about is this idea of, was it worth it? So we did all of this. I took them out. They all took their children out of places that were dangerous, where they felt like there was no hope for the future. If they could have chosen, they would have stayed home. And I think that's another misconception that people have. If given a real choice, people want to stay where they grew up. They love their homes, they love their families, they love where they grew up, but sometimes they have to leave, right, in that way. But then once the border happened, and then parents are left with the thought of, what if I don't get to see my child again? What if this trauma is so profound that all the dreams and hopes that I have are not going to materialize? So these parents are always working with the sacrifice, hoping for a better life, but without knowing exactly if the trajectory, if the journey could potentially be very traumatizing as well, as they're going through it. So the parents are always talking about guilt. The children are the assumed beneficiaries of all of this, but sometimes they tag along, right, with the parents. They themselves are not choosing. So the trust and the love is huge. But I always say, to migrate for a lot of these parents is to care. Right, is the deepest way of caring, is actually taking on this journey.
Well, I have to compliment you the way you wrote it. I'm a policy geek, and I loved the way that you interwove, policies that were happening at the time with real life examples. And you took us into stories, and then you took us out of them, and then you cited research and data, and it really was a very comprehensive view of what happened then. And it really shows, again, we have right now, the situation with a lot of migrants waiting south of the border again. And we're probably having the same situation happening to many families. And as you mentioned earlier, with the deportations that are going on, most of the families in your book are from the Northern Triangle. We've spoken about that before, the countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. But what I didn't know, and I learned from your book, was that Honduras has the GDP is in the bottom third of all countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And actually, something that I love, coffee, its blight led to an economic trigger that actually helped, force people to leave Honduras and come north. I mean, I kind of hadn't put that together. But, it's just a fascinating tale of these families giving it all up, as you mentioned, and coming to the border and encountering what they just did not expect.
Absolutely.
We've been speaking with Professor Gabrielle Oliveira, the author of a new book, Now We Are Here, Family Migration, Children's Education, and Dreams for a Better Life. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today, but hopefully we can have you on again in the future, ma'am, and talk a little bit more about your book, because me and Sandra during the break, but we're just so fascinated.
Fascinating.
So thank you so much for joining us today, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
All right, stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. Wanted to bring Sandra Sanchez back in before we get into some more headlines, because, again, we were just discussing Professor Oliveira's book during the break, and you brought up a very interesting fact.
Yeah, actually 5 of the children who she mentioned graduated high school, and they are in college. I mean, throughout the book, it talks about what they got from the American education system and how that also was a driver for parents as they endured all of this. But the children said that the schools are wonderful here and just how much they flourished and benefited. So you can read all of that in her book, Now We Are Here.
Yeah, and this is what it looks like in case you were getting on Google during this edition of Border Report Live. Another interesting thing she mentioned was the guilt, and it just, anecdotal evidence, obviously, right? But you and I both have interviewed so many different people from so many different countries that make their way to the South Texas, U.S.-Mexico border. And it seems like every time I've spoken to someone in these situations that the professor's book is about, it's been the same thing. It's the same two things. It's one, if we would have known it was going to be like this, we would have never come. And two, it's like a warning to others that may be watching the interview with them. don't come because it's not what they say it is.
There are parts of it that are heart-wrenching, and we live that here, being on the border. There was one woman, she brought her 14-year-old son because her 5-year-old child had a heart condition and knew the child could not make the journey, but then was just terribly conflicted because, she left behind a sick child, but she sends money to that child. And then she has to just get here and concentrate on the 14-year-old. And because of his age, he was separated from her in a different area because he was a teen male. But, just so many hurdles that they go through. And she really does explain it really well.
Yeah. Well, again, that book, Now We Are Here, Professor Gabrielle Oliveira, if you're interested in picking it up, from Stanford University Press. That's going to do it for us today. For Sandra Sanchez right here in Harlingen, Texas, my name is Rudy Mideles. We'll see you next time.